Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Open Internet Pod, live on X and on your favorite podcasting platform. You can find us now on Spotify and on Apple. We're working on other platforms, so
and
stay tuned for that.
Most importantly, via good old-fashioned Aaron Schwartz built-it RSS feeds, which mean you can use any tool you like to keep in touch. You don't have to go through the big boys if you don't want to. But if you like convenience, we're there too.
Important detail. Yeah. Well, speaking of convenience, but maybe not necessarily convenience, but well, let me just say it like this. The idea behind today's episode came from the realization that there's kind of this like quiet war happening against compute. And it's something that both Richard and I noticed, and we thought about how do we set this up so that it makes sense, and that led to this search through legislation that is coming up and stuff like HR 8250 in America, the Parents Decide Act. And
the metastasization of the originally California 1045, I think it was. But yeah, these children protection acts, which are going to have OSs doing very strange things just to comply.
Exactly, and it's very not necessarily scary, but worrying, because it's no longer just one thing happening here or one thing happening there. They're starting to multiply, right? And you do realize that it's kind of like a squeeze on client side autonomy. The capacity for the individual to make its all his or her own decisions and use their own compute and internet how they see fit, that's starting to no longer be acceptable.
No, it's another Dr. Rovian term of like the war against general compute. And when he talked about it, he talked about the coming war on general compute in 2011. And I think, yeah, like Alex said, it's not a stand-up, hot war as they call it. It's more of a stealthy Cold War with a lot of espionage and a lot of slow steps and maneuvering. But I think we're right in the middle of it. We're in some of the hottest days of it. And it really comes down to the question of, with all of your communications equipment, but most obviously with computing and computers, devices, are you able to take that device and do what you want with it without having to go through an intermediary, without having to have permission or some kind of control? So that's not the same as like, if you have some kind of Wi-Fi wireless radio device, you have to get, you can't just broadcast randomly. Not that question, but like if you have a computer, can you put the operating system you want on it? Can you use it to connect it to other devices, however you like? And as soon as we start talking like that, you start thinking of all the different things you can and can't do these days. Like, oh, this is a Google device. It only works with this subset of things, or this is an Apple device that's in its ecosystem. And there's actually a precious few places where like an Apple device can talk to, say, a Google ecosystem device like an Android phone, like the SMS layer, and not in every country. Like some countries that's proprietary and they don't talk. And this is like gone from like, oh, okay, that's curious, to more and more things where they're starting to mandate, corporations are pushing for their what they want from their side, and the state is mandating regulation and requirements from their side to say you have to tell your computer how old you are. Literally that. And funnily enough, even if it's the operating system control system for an airplane, you apparently have to tell it how old you are, because technically that's what the legislation says. So this has gone from being kind of like something that nerds might get annoyed about because they can't put the operating system of their choice on some old piece of software, to like a real daily thing that every user of any kind of system is starting to bump into. And soon enough, whenever you buy a phone, if that phone can be sold in the US, part of the turning it on is going to be it asking you how old you are, and depending on how far these rules go, it's going to ask you for some kind of Face ID and identity document on the way through.
Yeah, exactly. And the whole idea here was, let's not be, all doom and gloom.
Mm.
At least attempt an exercise in imagination and explore possible scenarios, both good and, let's say, bad, that could follow after these regulations get implemented. And in order to do that, I think we kind of have to understand these base level stipulations that are hidden in something like Parents Decide Act. Because if you just see it in the news or just hear about it, you don't really understand what's in it. So let's have a look at Parents Decide Act. And the biggest change here is the shift from app verification to device verification. What this implies for anonymous devices, privacy or dissidents, and even for open source software, how would this change affect those scenarios, both good and bad?
Yeah, well, I think it's super interesting because, the first thing is you've moved, and it's subtle, but it's really important, that point you made. We're moving from applications, and that could be a porn website or whatever, being responsible for saying, well, okay, should check how old you are or whatever, to the device itself. And there's a world in which that seems really logical, right? Because it's just so much easier, right? Do it at the device level, then it's universal, then the app doesn't have to do all this work of how the hell is an app supposed to actually verify how old you are? It was a bit of a joke that they tried. Do it on the device. What we're not thinking about necessarily there is the fact that you've essentially immediately doxed yourself. Anything that's stored in a computer system will be breached and will be divulged at some time. As well as the fact that we've set up the mechanism to make that more and more onerous, right? So, there's a point at which right now it's supposed to be that it asks you and you just say what your age is, and then the operating system will carefully only tell apps what age bracket you're in. And it won't, so the simplest version would be 18 or not, or whatever, depending on the laws in the area. But of course, you've now created a space in the operating system where that data is kept. So now anybody who's after that data knows precisely where it is. You've also got a place for, that to be then required and expanded. So now they could start wanting, well, okay, what's your ID data in there? What's all sorts of other things? And because that's now possible, the idea that, you could actually, for instance, as a dissident, be able to, or a whistleblower. I mean, a whistleblower is a great example as well, because it's someone that, actually benefits everyone around them. But for them to be able to act anonymously becomes almost impossible, because they can't get and use a device without either having to do some, jump through some hoops to fake things, or put someone else at risk by using their device. But whatever's done with that device is going to be trackable at some level back to whoever used it. And I think that's really scary.
Not only is it scary, but you can also think about the two most known whistleblowers of our time and the amount of flack that they both received for doing so. And I'm thinking of Edward Snowden and Julian Assange.
Yeah.
Both who unmasked huge control systems and, money-making war machines. And both were pursued to the end of the earth for that specific reason. They were supposed to be made an example of. So one had to hide in an embassy for 11 years and the other had to literally run to the exact enemy of the United States in order to ensure safety, right? Go to Russia. So imagine how tasty this sort of technology is to some control system, because they can more or less guarantee there will be no Snowden, there will be no Assange.
No, exactly. It puts a royal break on ability to do that. and it's sort of kind of interesting because it then trickles down to all sorts of other levels, like simple things like corporate misbehavior, etc. Right? Like you're going to talk about the large company you're working for breaking environmental rules or committing other, slight to massive misdeeds. If you know that you had to, every communication device you can possibly use has had to be essentially at the very minimum tracked, but possibly bugged on behalf of some kind of authority who you're not clear who they are. So I think this is really clear, and the kind of scary thing is that this comes from corporate desire as well to be able to say what you can and can't do with equipment because they're just after their rent, right? And so you get this happiness, and it's where we were going before with the shift from the app to the device, right? There's a little kind of a push and pull between different corporate entities there because the apps, who at the moment are in the ascendancy, except for maybe Apple, on the software side have the power, and they're pushing to the hardware and the device makers this need to do this government work of essentially command and control away from websites and onto devices because it's more profitable to run Facebook if you can just make the phone manufacturers do all this work rather than you doing it at your portal gate. And so I think we see this kind of slippery kind of lobbying and pushing from corporates and particularly from big internet providers trying to push this agenda weirdly because it's actually very much in their interest to have it pushed down because it then gives them less to worry about. It makes competing with them much harder, and it lets them basically just ignore any responsibilities they should technically have because it should have been handled by the phone itself or the device, the computer itself.
Yeah, exactly. So there's, I guess there's a lot of power and very little responsibility of how that power is used, and pretty much zero capacity to protest against that power because if you have root access or you mandate the rules, then you can literally also decide who gets a voice and who doesn't get a voice.
Well,
So
yeah, I mean, it starts with the sales job that's done, so the Protect Children Act or whatever, right? So the first line of defense against people pushing back is, well, this is being done to protect children, or this is being done for state security. We have to, terrorists and things, bad things will happen. And so the first thing that you have to get past if you want to start pointing this stuff out is those arguments that were like, it's the classical why do you hate America kind of take down, not take down, but response to saying anything negative, right? Like that's the immediate defense is, well, why don't you want children to be protected, right? And so you have to get through that in the first instance before you even get to these controls, right?
and it's very interesting you bring that up because I've read reports that up to 500,000 children disappear in America every year. Yet there's no movement in that direction to recover these children, to investigate what has happened to them. There's no push in those directions because obviously that would make more sense if you want to protect children. But instead you focus on some technology because this technology actually works for your own agenda, right? So
well, I think that what that does is uncover the people themselves, individuals, are horrible at like risk assessment. So yeah, you got a whole lot of people who worry about all sorts of things to do with diet or food, and yet they do things in cars that put them at far more risk than the food choices that they're obsessing about, right? So people are terrible at that sort of stuff. But what you're saying is important because we're not talking about individuals here. We're talking about the states and organizations who have the ability to make the decisions over time and are tasked with thinking them through. And yes, what are they concentrating on, right? Like, I'm actually pretty sure that things like missing persons and investigations into child disappearances are pretty heavily handled at the local level by law enforcement and various things. But what we're talking about here is what is the top end of the state doing, and what are they publicizing? And they're not they're not doing an overall survey of what's putting children at risk and then prioritizing those things one by one, which would probably in some places start with like school lunches. But they're actually, they're doing these things. And the reason is not that it's actually high priority necessarily in terms of these things, but because it's convenient. And the other tell for that is, I think, that if you genuinely want to help children deal with technology and with the online world, etc., then the task is to, look at schooling, education, and parenting, and how you get those right for kids growing up in this world. And that's obviously difficult, and doesn't seem to come into question very much. I mean, I'm a father, my kids go to school. Actually, they do have those programs. We're not hearing anything about that. Right. And they're pretty piecemeal, right? They're not putting a huge amount of effort into those things. As, this stuff is front page news and politicians are out there trying to get a boost by selling in Australia, the social media ban for under 16s got a lot of press, and there were a lot of politicians lining up to look helpful or concerned. And a lot of politicians, funnily enough, talking about, giving big tech a punch in the nose, which was hysterical given that big tech was right behind it.
Yeah, it's I guess it's a question of incentive structures, and you kind of see them right there. You see them at play. Okay, so we kind of figured out that it's really, really easy to punch hole in this whole argument and to find the bad scenario. Now, let's say, what would be a good scenario? What would be something positive that could come out of this?
I mean, there's various ways that I think good things happen with this stuff. So, if you remember a while ago, there was a case in, I think, San Diego or something, of there was a couple who'd planned some kind of mass incident, and the local police department went toe-to-toe with Apple about getting into the phone. And Apple told them, look, actually, we can't help you. We really actually can't. This thing's probably locked down. And the good thing that came out of that was, I think people understood a little bit more after that about the relationship between them, the state, and hardware providers, right? So the good thing that came out of that is that Apple ended up looking good for having stood their ground. And I think that's where most of the benefit for this sort of thing comes out. So in my case, with the social media ban, it actually did get me to do a reassessment on where I was at with my parenting my kids, where we were at thinking about those sorts of things. And you've got kids, you do have to think about these things. This is important. So I think that's one side. It will actually help maybe bring awareness. And I think in coalescing against something as strong as like the chat control stuff that's going on in Europe, you are seeing an increased awareness. Like groups like the Chaos Computer Club are looking slightly less kooky, right? And the guys in the hoodies with the laptops with the stickers on them coding in the dark are starting to look a little less crazy and more like people you might want to consult about security, because of these things, because it's actually coming out and people seeing just how draconian these things are. So I think there's a bunch of things around that. And then my hope, and I mean, just from a side perspective, I think is that people will start to see the nexus of control around computing generally, where we started off, right? That the machine and the network are subject to enclosure, and that you really want to start looking at tools and methods of getting yourself able to just be using tools that work for you, that you can choose how you use them, etc. And I actually believe that the resulting environment, the resulting computing environment, the resulting software environment will be really amazingly more vibrant and interesting and cool, right? In the same way that like college radio rescued pop music in the 80s and 90s, and it goes through cycles, but it's not good to pop music, but like having that indie scene meant that you could have something new come out of a pretty dry and crusty old system. And I think that to me is the really cool thing, is actually there's sort of 4 or 5 providers, one YouTube, 3 or 4 online document services, 5 or 6. I mean, the funny thing is streaming services have kind of proliferated, but they've gone back to the TV model now. This kind of walled garden is stifling. It's like living in a shitty mall. And people will get excited when they actually start to see, in an open environment, new stuff happens and it doesn't need permission, and so it can be fresh and raw and interesting.
Yeah, and it's very, very interesting that you would have this sort of dichotomy, because you start in a very comfortable situation, right? So, because I'm looking at things like, why won't people change? And I can use myself as an example. Like I bought a Pixel to install Graphene OS on it, but then I used a bit of Android and realized that I actually like it. and my entire plan to become more resilient and more sovereign digitally just flew out the window because of Google Gemini trading my phone, and being able to use QuickShare to airdrop to other people. And I just realized, like, man, if I'm in the middle of these things and I still find it difficult, imagine what it's like for normal people. So I guess, in a way, it has to get worse before it can get better. And I think that, especially in the Western world, where people have not had contact with authoritarian regimes, they don't really know what it can be like. And that's why you see a bit of this, like, difference, at least in Europe, between the Eastern Europe and Central and Western Europe, because in the East they know what it's like. They have a fresh memory of pre-1989, and they're like, we don't want to go back there. While in the West, that doesn't exist, so it's much easier for them to just walk into this trap, in a way, because they have no idea what's on the other side. And maybe we have to end up with that scenario before this, change that you speak of, this flourishing on the edges, which usually that's how tech grows, on the edges, right? Because that's where you have the motivation to do something new.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's the classic thing that's happened. So, the big tech firms have now got so much, gunpowder, so much collateral, that they can infiltrate almost any new space that comes along, right? Or just buy into it. So it's only a new area, like doing something like Uber did, where it was like, or Airbnb, where it's like, well, not in the tech space, and they bring something into the tech space that matters. But, music is now controlled by very few providers, et cetera, right? Like it's gotten very, very stale. And, that leads to a push towards sterility. So, like, obviously Spotify, YouTube Music, whatever it is, they would rather, they want to get all the music so they can keep everybody happy, but they would also, in that process, like to push everybody towards 2 artists if they could, because then that's easier to keep everybody happy, right? And so you get this natural tendency to just want to bring things into the most banal form. And I think that's somewhere where we will see, a genuine pushback, because people will discover other things, other workarounds, other ways of getting things. And I think the same thing will happen with communications. People will just get, like beyond the point where Snapchat seems novel, right? Because it's just another platform, and they'll actually want things where, things like there isn't an algorithm, there isn't a central provider, and they can feel it, so that they know it's just a messy space of individuals interacting. And that's where, genuine things can happen. And so I think that's really probably the long-term benefit, is that we start to see more of those things. And And it's kind of interesting to me, like when and where that happens with hardware as well. Like, talked earlier about the sort of the fight against the general computer, and we've got more and more phones and tablets, which are the opposite of that. They're a general computer that's strapped down into a very, very tight set of things it can do. Will we, and to what extent will we see people kind of trying to branch away from that? And I think we might see it also in ways we're not anticipating, like running agents and models and things on servers and realizing, oh, it's good to be able to do whatever you want rather than having to be in this sort of, set of provider-produced systems. And, that to me is exciting and interesting.
Yeah, and let's use this as a segue into what's happening in the EU, because as bad as what we talked about in regards to the Parents Decide Act, we also have chat control, which was rejected twice now in quick succession, which kind of means it'll probably be pushed a third and a fourth and a fifth time until it eventually gets accepted, right? And
but yeah. The fact that it's Lazarus once gives you a sense that it might do it again.
Exactly. And let's see what that implies for normal people. First and foremost, you have client-side scanning.
Mm-hmm.
So instead of the government asking, let's say, WhatsApp or Signal or Apple to break their encryption, the law would require the app on your phone to scan your photos and messages before they are encrypted and sent. So that's step one. Then step two would be the black box. Your device would compare your private photos against a government-provided database of hashes, digital fingerprints, of illegal material. If a match is found, the app automatically secretly forwards the content to a law enforcement clearinghouse. Nothing can go wrong with that technology, right?
Well, I mean, the nerd in me immediately realizes how you could absolutely frame someone, because, like, it would be super easy to, you send someone a zip file that unzips into a bunch of contraband material, and whammo, they're in, response. And you immediately also start thinking of, like, this is hashes, but I think they also want to run, like, low-end machine learning stuff to, like, check for child exploitation videos. And you get the example that's trotted out time and again, because it's horrific, of a doctor being arrested for sharing, a picture of a kid with a rash or whatever with a colleague in a medical context, right? So there's all of that. And I mean, it was interesting because you were saying earlier, I'm trying to remember if it was in the pre-show or once we started, talking about like this sort of these offline kind of legacy control mechanisms now making their way into the world of computing. And I think, the thing you see here is like this, it does, like, the sort of chat control doesn't make any sense until you see it in that context and you realize that those control mechanisms, what the state or what the people who run them were interested in was the level of control. And maybe not even that, but the level of either security or arse covering, depending on which way you look at it, those methods gave them. And in a physical world, there was a lot of leeway, a lot of time to kind of catch up with people. There's a lot of time to make sure the enforcement and things worked. Whereas in the digital world, things are so fast, you can't rely on that. So they've gone to this pre-crime model, right? They've gone to this, we'll scan it before you send it, which seems logical if your metrics are around, what level of control you were getting out of the system before, and, wanting to transplant that idea into the digital world. But if you look at it other ways, like jurisprudence, and there's very varied legal systems between North America, most of Europe, and various other places. And yet there seems to be coming up with this, sort of breaching themselves on some of their own fundamental principles about like how stuff is supposed to be happening, because they're moving towards these pre-control things. And it's the same with KYC, with banking and all sorts of other things. You now have to prove or argue what you want to do with the money before a bank will give you your own money at times, which is, like, where did that come from?
Exactly, and I think this is the perfect perfect time to actually showcase this sort of event with something that actually happened. And because you might think, oh, this doesn't this doesn't affect me, this is has nothing to do with me. But you have to understand that once these mechanisms are in place, uh, they're going to be used. So it's not that we're only sanctioning Russian assets or something like that. No, you will have an automated mechanism that will sanction anyone that doesn't fit within
Mm.
the prescribed
Well,
behavior. And
yeah, I mean, going back to what you were saying before, like how much of Snowden making it to the Soviet Union, it's not the Soviet Union, to Russia, there's a bit of a slip there, but how much of that was possible because he went via Hong Kong, which is a place which was renowned as a kind of, had a bit of a trading port mentality at the time. And so he could do, a few things and slip through some cracks because they weren't, super fast to chase up and lock borders. But if every single device and every single thing is, tightened up to the point where there's none of that leeway, then Snowden gets arrested 2 meters outside his house. If he even gets that far, if he even gets the information out in the first place, and that I think is concerning.
yeah, and I have an example here to show Colonel Jack Bow, a Swiss army general that worked with NATO in various capacities, who was critical of the war in Ukraine, and he got well. Let's see if I can just let him describe what has happened to him. I have this interesting video that I want to share with you guys. Uh, should be, if you give me 1 second. Here we go. Let's listen to.
Because the decision to put me under sanction was extrajudicial, meaning that I didn't breach any law, I didn't breach any regulation wherever they are. I just accepted my right to express myself, and I haven't been the sanction haven't been decided by any judge or any court, basically. So now we have to attack a political decision through a judicial process. And that's what we are doing. So I don't know exactly where the things stand because the document is now being.
Yeah. Anyway, you heard the man. So you end up in a situation where there's not even a way to attack or protect yourself. You are completely at their mercy, and the mechanism is there. What this shows is that the
Mm.
mechanism already exists, which means that if they use it for him, they can use it for everybody.
Well, I mean, to genuinely kind of put the frighteners into people, I think very few people probably in the audience, if you've been online for any length of time, have lived online without the experience of having been deplatformed off something. An account got closed. I've been de-PayPal'd and a couple other things. Not so much for compared to people I know, but that process is very jolting, right? Because there's no you don't have any kind of redress that matches the impact it has on you, right? You don't have you can go and talk to the customer service or whatever, but they don't have any serious obligations, to follow up or to look after you or to give you genuine reasons for things happening, and can just reply with pro forma documents, etc., etc. And I think what's scary in Bod's case is, yeah, it's the extrajudiciality of it, and I think that again makes people extrajudicial sounds like a legal term. What it means is non-legal, not illegal, but non-legal, right? In the sense that you don't. It's very similar to PayPal just closing your account, except that this is your bank accounts or your right to travel or all sorts of things, and this is being done on the back of these kind of controls, having breached the control mechanism, right? And so I think Assange is a great case. Snowden is a great case. He's a lesser known case with a very much more specific set of circumstances. But yes, it's this ability to not have to go through legal proceedings, which have their accompanying controls and balances, and just be able to do an incredible amount of if not damage to people, like coercive restriction, without having to actually take any risk or provide any justification. And that to me is the kind of really concerning thing there.
Yeah, and this is also the way I'm looking at it. This is also why it's so important to have the network as a moat, to have a network that treats everybody in the same way. Because if you have a network where somebody has root access, right, that's the sort of power that will be abused. Nobody will be able to resist that, because you have the judiciary way of fixing the problem, which may take time. You might get scandals, or you have the extrajudiciary, which just like silence them. You deplatform them, right? And this is when I say that the network is the moat, that's really it. Because once these regulations move into the OS, they're already in the apps. When they move to the OS,
right? Well, this is why there's a bunch of things that are important here. One reason is why browsers are such a big deal, right? Like the operating system has really moved away from the device. That's like a thin layer now that just controls how the apps actually connect to the USB or whatever it is. The reality is that it's the apps or the browser that produce the experience, and the browser is the last thing we have on most of our devices that is open by default, that lets you decide where you're going without restriction, rather than telling you and deciding where your connections head, etc. So there are always little kind of impingements into that, like trying to set who your default search engine is, because people know defaults are king. But you can still mess with that stuff. You can still choose to do it differently. And so that's why like the browser is vital, because it's the last place where you don't need permission from an app store to put an app up. And it's really, really important. And this is why, obviously at Cider we browser first, because it doesn't require distribution through controlled channels. But then at the network layer, you've got this very important distinction. And one of the things that really matters is what in the US is called carrier protection, right? So sensibly, governments realized in the early days that you couldn't really run a phone company if the phone company could be responsible for someone ordering drugs or, booking a hit on someone or whatever, doing illegal things on the phone. So the phone company, was given carrier protection to say you're not responsible for someone planning a murder over the phone, which is important because otherwise we wouldn't have phones. And the internet has the same protection. That was decided early on in the US, and in most places it has some form of that, where the ISPs are not expected to monitor and control all traffic, and in fact they're not supposed to, and they're not held responsible for people doing wrong things. It's somewhere else in the stack. But we see that being come for, and so the one way you can protect yourself against that is full encryption, and the HTTPS push that the Electronic Freedom Frontier Foundation have done is massive as a first step in that. Making sure that it's easy to get proper encryption on your browsers and stuff. Unfortunately, that whole layer is still centralized, so you still have central certificate authorities. So what it means is if you can trust that system, if none of those have been compromised, then you have proper security. It's good. It keeps your privacy against people spying on you to various places, but it's not security. What we really need is a network that gives people the ability to manage their own cryptography entirely autonomously. So it's them and the maths, basically. And that's really vital, because that's the only way you can have a trustless system where you don't have to trust anybody doing anything. Because if you receive one half of a cryptographic key swap, so long as you're confident who the person is that sent it to you, and that's always a challenge, but that's a physical challenge you can never get around. The human equivalent would be if someone can, wear an Edgar suit and pretend to be someone else. So long as you're sure about that, the math is solid, right? Quantum or no, cryptography is cryptography, and it means you have your own ability to communicate privately about anything with anyone on the other end of that communication. And the usual way of trying to limit that is to hit it at the supply end of like, how do you get your hands on cryptography? And people nowadays will think that seems silly, but they're not remembering in the 90s where the US actually tried to produce a export ban on cryptography, which is just a sign that this is exactly the point, is already made, that this is important, right? Being able to distribute the means of cryptographic security to people freely so that they can then interact freely is a vital step. So you need a network that has no choke points, that has no single source of being able to lock it off. And I think this is something that people don't necessarily understand about CIDO is, right now, we have pretty general access to the internet, so you run it on the internet, but it doesn't have to be run on the internet. You could literally run CIDO with USB keys being shifted around between computers if you really, really wanted to. It could go on to radio frequency or anything else. That's vitally important. What that means is you have an independent way that's provably independent of communicating that's strong against these kind of forces. Because we've seen, like I was saying, at the OS level, was initially kind of, at the software level, at the OS level, at the device level, at the network level, at every single point that there's been, attempts to push and restrict and to control and push people into permissioned systems where they have to be identified and have to have permission to use the system. And browsers on an independent cryptographic network is basically the last absolutely sure way we have of knowing that we're communicating in an independent way.
Yeah, and the question would arise: would you have something like Sato, which does all these things and is creating a network of peers? Why is it that everybody wants the other model? What is so appealing about the other model?
Largely at the moment it's network effects, but it's also just what people have been brought to expect, right? So people are used to, the first things first, right? They're used to just handing over their entire identity and anything they'll do in the system and just giving up on any kind of autonomy or ability to take anything out of the system. And then being given, what's available in the system in a controlled way, which, given that it's, produced in capitalist pleasure lands, is enjoyable. It's not bad. It's probably better than some of the things that, people had previously, like just being able to instantly have an infinite CD collection seems amazing to anyone who remembers actually having to go and buy CDs and budget for them. So that's been the way in, and then I think people just don't appreciate necessarily where things could and will grow to be if you go outside of those systems, because they're still maybe more than they expected, and so they're not seeing everything that they're not getting out of them. And so you can kind of say, like, imagine only having 3 TV series, let alone channels or whatever. Like, that's all you have. That's roughly what we kind of have now. In terms of online providers in a lot of spaces, you have 1 or 2 providers providing stuff. But people just come to expect that, and they're not used to looking for themselves. They're not used to looking out past things. And they're also, the people who are trying to promote stuff outside of that system have very few ways to do it. And so that's really, to my mind, the reason for that. But I also can see it crumbling really quickly as, the cool kids start to look over the fence and see what's over there.
Yeah, let's hope the kids are listening and getting on the train.
Yeah.
because it is true, and it's a question of like how do you balance comfortability, laziness, and the repercussions of that behavior, because obviously distribution is very different. Once you're the person who's the incumbent, right, your distribution is just so overwhelming.
Mm.
And when you're coming up, you have very limited distribution, and you're fighting not only the distribution model, but you're also fighting the level of comfort that people are used to.
Mm.
So you kind of have to end up, like you said, in the situation where the resort turns into the prison camp
Mm.
before people start trying to look over the fence, and you have to pray to God that that fence is not 4 or 5 meters tall and barbed wired, so they can actually sneak a peek over the fence.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's an interesting thing because you get McDonald's. I don't think anyone argues that McDonald's is the finest of the culinary experiences out there in the world, but they're a very successful chain, right? And there's a place for that. I'm not going to tell people not to go to McDonald's. I think what happens is after a while, people who realize the 3 or 4 restaurant chains that I have a choice between are really no choice at all, and they discover something else, right? That's where things are going, and we see it everywhere. I mean, you talk to Australians about the food, like eating in Australia before 1950, I mean, basically before Southern European immigration and then Asian immigration, and it was dire. People boiled lamb for breakfast because that's what they thought had, exactly. There was nothing. People were very happy that they had high amounts of protein, basically, compared to places they'd come from. They could afford lots of protein, but the food was awful. And, that has changed over the years. You had supermarket white bread, which is still there on the shelves, but as a percentage of the bread eaten, it's gone down from 90-something% to, whatever it is today, I'm not sure. But people have reached out and they've gone and realized actually going and getting something freshly baked might be a good thing to do, even though it's 500-year-old technology, because it's delicious. And I think that's going to be the change, is that we need to keep that alive so that people can have those experiences, as well as so that those tools are there when they really need them, like when someone needs to speak genuinely privately or securely with somebody else, whether that's personal or whether it's a matter of state security or whatever, that we have those tools available, that it's not, become impossible because every, device needs to be registered and, pre-screens everything you do on it before you use it.
Yeah, and I think that unless you understand the amount of surveillance that was happening in Eastern Europe, where you couldn't trust your neighbors, you couldn't trust members of your family, there was this like complete and utter distrust at all layers.
East Germany were at one point like 1/3 of adults were at least reporting back to the Stasi. So.
Exactly, and it's not just Germany. There, like Poland, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria.
Well, the Germans just kept really good records.
Exactly. There's a very interesting movie that I think won the Palme d'Or some years ago about one of these officers that was listening to a dissident and got so much insight into the man's life that he became like fond of the other person and instead tried to help him. So that's the sort of connection you had with the people listening to you. And that's an unfortunate case, but it highlights the issue. And you can imagine, at least at that point, there was a human interaction that could backfire and actually help you because on a human level, it related to your struggle. Imagine if you replace that person with an algorithm. How's that?
Well, I think that's with things like chat control. That's what people aren't saying, is like you start off with like the hashing thing. So like, is this particular image exactly the same as an image we have in our database? Which is absurd because you change one pixel, it hashes to something different. So then they'll be starting to say, well, let's do some general image recognition, which is when you get the kid with a rash getting the doctor landed in jail problem. But the next step is to say, well, let's just do an LLM like summary of the kind of thing you're talking about. And you end up with, there was a case in apartheid South Africa where a guy who was playing correspondence chess with someone in Europe was arrested for sending codes because he was just sending telegrams with like chess moves in it. Right? And the dumbasses at the South African secret police, who were not usually the brightest ones, just didn't understand that this was actually just a game of chess, and tortured the guy for several hours about why he was sending secret messages overseas before it was all cleared up. This is sort of the step by step that you can expect things to happen. If there's a mandate to screen things on your phone, then all that needs to happen is an event of some kind that gives permission to say, it makes it look like, well, obviously we could have caught this thing, or this terrible thing may not have happened if we'd had this extra screening. So let's add that to the protocol before you run.
Are you talking about the Patriot Act by any chance?
That's they tried that sort of stuff there, but I'm talking, well beyond that, where at some point you get arrested for trying to send a letter to a friend because it happened to crunch down to some algorithmically similar thing to something else that had been said, right? Because there was a code and an LLM analyzed it to look a certain way, and your letter to your friend did the same thing. You're trying to send a note on a birthday card or whatever, and you get arrested because, the pre-screener just couldn't work out what it was. This is exactly what they tried to push through with parts of the Patriot Act and had in the US for a while. And I think it's coming back with things like chat control, where the sort of pre-screening idea is just genuinely frightful, because they're using some very again unhelpful. It's like that meme of the gate sitting in the middle of nowhere, like over the path, but you can just walk around it. What they're talking about now is a version of that, which is pointless and no one will really care about. But it's the infrastructure is being put in place to then say, well, okay, well now we've had an incident of type X, so we have to therefore start monitoring for that. And suddenly everybody's phones are snitching on them in ways that, yes, like you're saying, it's not a human reading it and understanding, oh, that was a joke, or or your friend really, you are just sending someone directions to get to a place in London. They'll just assume, the algorithm says you're a terrorist. Suddenly, that's what the entire system decides you are, and that's just got to be something we're concerned about.
Yeah, and it's also funny that we have this, how should I put it? Not propensity, but we kind of look down on China and say, oh my God, look at that authoritarian credit score. Look what happened to these people, and those people, they cannot travel, they cannot do anything, they cannot buy tickets. And then on the other side, like, what's happening to us? It's the exact same thing, but this is like you can see it when it happens somewhere else, but you literally cannot see it when it's happening at home.
Yeah, the funny thing is, like, for a long time, in having lived in China and talking to people about it, they found the Western system of the credit rating unbelievably frightening. Right? The idea that there would be independent corporations that weren't under heavy government control that could decide whether you could have credit, whether they could deny you a home loan. And to a Chinese person, that would have meant, in certain circumstances, you can't get married because you essentially needed that to get married. This was horrifying. And yet in the West, we're like, oh, it's a credit rating agency. Of course you have those, right? And then the Chinese add a credit rating system, which it's so funny because if you've ever lived with it, it's like a little gamified thing in your phone, and it gives you basically rights and access to like bonuses and things, more like a frequent flyer program. And then separately, they brought in measures to so if people had committed certain crimes, actual crimes, that they would then like one of the punishments would be not prison, but like inability to use business class level travel, etc. And those things were conflated. But it's quite funny because, yes, the picture in Westerners' heads was like, oh, it's China being massively draconian. Meanwhile, there's a large hand coming over their shoulder like from behind here, and people are like, well, that makes perfect sense because this is this is just an extension of the credit system we had. But I think you can often see those precursors. I mean, in a lot of ways, the Chinese state simply didn't have the civil pushback to worry about, so just implemented directly things that have been danced around until we've gotten there in the West, right? Same thing, just they felt free to say, we want to control the internet and this is how we'll do it. You have to have real name verification and age verification. And they just said it from day one, whereas here it's being wedged in slowly, but it's exactly the same result in the end.
Yeah, and if you look at it maybe with a suspicious eye, you might think that by doing it this way, by making it private first, they could push the envelope in ways that maybe they couldn't do if it was like state-owned and people would have expectations and so on. So this way you can get like a much further, deeper...
Well, I mean, if you were like an analyst in the Chinese state, you'd probably just look at the Westerns and say, you guys are feebly, just inept at being, authoritarian. Because in the West, I mean, largely this stuff came through corporate channels. So like that war on general compute started with things like DRM. So it started with companies wanting that same real world control they had over things like distribution of CDs to translate into the computing world, and they realized quickly to do that we have to cripple computers. We can't let people use them for whatever they want. They can't be general devices. So the industry immediately wanted people to have a Fire Stick equivalent, right? Like a thing that's a computer, but it only gets stuff off the App Store, right? That they immediately saw that that's what they wanted as soon as they could invent it. And that's then like informed government, I think, a lot on what they could do in the West, whereas in authoritarian regimes that the government's just taken the lead and said, what do we want? How do we do it? But it's kind of interesting because in the end it's the same. It's a push to the same result, I think, in both cases. And there's a lot of people telling themselves it's okay who don't think that's the case.
Yeah, and it's similar to the business model that they had with the economy. So, for example, in let's say communist states, it would be a centralized planned economy, and they would have so many loops through which to jump that nobody wanted to do it, and you couldn't really make bank on it either because the state would come and take credit for it. While in the West, they would let you run with it, and then when you got big enough, they would just come in and tax you. So they would let you earn money so that they have something to tax. And that was maybe the model, that the difference in models, that even though both ended up capturing the value, by doing it super early, you kind of like stunted growth. And maybe it's the same thing here. They let it run because they wanted to see how far can this technology go. And now you have stuff like Alexa and all the Google Pixels and all these Internet of Things devices that listen to you everywhere, and they can just see everything that you do. And then maybe this was the idea all along.
Well, I think what you see in the growth of the Chinese tech sphere was exactly the lesson that they'd actually learned that from the Soviet model, right? And they didn't do the control from the start. They would so when new things came up, they let it explode into its craziness and then regulate it. They kind of set it up as a competition to see who could regulate it within the government ministries, and did the same thing, handed out the rewards for the capture, right? So the people who did the best job of capturing it and regulating it got rewarded with being allowed to do that, and they got to hand out the licenses to the companies that then were allowed to actually proceed. And so you had at one point like 200 streaming, you get like 200 YouTubes in China all streaming illegal content. And once they were just like, there was zero IP protection. You could watch anything you wanted from anywhere. And then, the government came in and sort of also won points with the West for saying, "Oh yes, we'll get on top of this," which they always plan to do. but then they kind of whittled it down to the few players that they felt were doing a good job and who worked well with the regulators. And yes, right in the end, the control and the revenue stream went exactly where they wanted it. But it was a learned lesson, right? Not to chop it off too early.
Yeah, I think this topic probably deserves an extra episode. I think we just scratch the surface here a little bit. So maybe we'll continue this conversation next week and dig
maybe
further.
Call out to people as well who are following. Hit us up on Red Square if you're a Cyto person, or Twitter if you've just bumped into us, and hit us up with where you think there's where you'd like more in depth, because I spend a lot of time kind of reading up and thinking about these things, as well as on the other side building Cyto to kind of combat them. But yeah, be always interested to have stuff thrown our way and get into more detail if people think things are particularly interesting, etc. We talk about this sort of stuff on a daily basis, and maybe there's things that aren't clear to people, or things that could do with a bit more exploration, and we'd be happy to do that.
Definitely, and don't forget to look for us on the RSS feed and on Apple Podcast and Spotify. It's Open Internet Pod or Open Internet Podcast, and I guess we'll see you guys next week. Have a good one.